everybody. So today's lecture, we're going to look at changes in popular culture and the effects that Western missionaries and Christianity had in Korea, as well as how this also helped Korean nationalism to develop. So if we look at just general trends during the Joseon Dynasty as to how culture was developing, um, in the first half of the Joseon Dynasty, the culture was heavily influenced by Confucianism. And so if we look at a painting like this right here, this uses Confucian motifs and generally focuses on nature. They're highly stylized, and we have a lot of landscape paintings. These kinds of landscape paintings often would depict a scene or a location from China. And what you see here is this really massive depictions of nature, like mountains and trees and whatnot. And you don't really see too many people because it's supposed to represent that man is very small in the universe, and thus should we need to develop humility and modesty and to be humble and to know our place in the universe and in the world, and that we need to have respect for these greater principles that define the universe. So these are the kinds of paintings that we see throughout generally the first half of the Joseon Dynasty. And then these paintings begin to change from the mid-dynasty on, and as you get later on into the dynasty. The paintings and the style and the subject matter, these all begin to change. And so instead now, what we begin to see, instead of depictions of Chinese locations or Chinese sages from the ancient past, now we begin to see things that are identifiably Korean or from the Joseon Dynasty. And so what we see here is this, this is a very typical Korean or Yangban style home, a hanok, a traditional home. And here is the madang, or the courtyard, and here we have a Korean Yangban who is sitting and most likely studying. And so through these types of painters, we begin to see now actual depictions of Korean life or life during the Joseon Dynasty. This one was painted by CHOSON, and he was a very famous court painter. He is and we see that he depicted many different scenes of Korean life. Here's another very famous painting, and you can tell it's immediately identifiable as Korean because of the architecture, because of the style of and the scenery, the landscape in the background. Here's another one. It's still, you can still see the Confucian influence because here we have, again, it's really nature that is being emphasized, and that is what jumps out at you when we first look at it, and the person here is quite small. So again, the reminder that we as humans are small within the greater universe and thus must be humble and modest. But it's still identifiably Korean. Another very famous painter towards the end of the Joseon dynasty was Kim Hongdo, and he also depicted scenes from everyday Korean life. This is a picture of a school. This is a sodang, and here we have the boys who are studying in a very traditional style school. This is the teacher right here, and this is a student who has been scolded by the teacher, probably for not studying hard enough. Another painting by Kim Hongdo, and here we have the depiction of a Yangban, and you see that he's in this rather leisurely position, and he's watching the commoners, or could be slaves, who are working. They are threshing the rice, and it really depicts the stark contrast of social class and the roles that different different strata of society play. Yet another one. Here we have the depiction of Yangban who are practicing archery. Archery was a very famous pastime during the Joseon dynasty. And here we have a shaman who is dancing. Another famous painter was Shin Yunbo, and here we have a picture, a painting of Yangban officials, and they are being entertained by the kiseng, or the female entertainers. And there are quite a few of these kinds of paintings that he painted. Here the kiseng are performing a sword dance for the Yangban officials. This is a scene of two lovers who are meeting at very late at night. We know this because of the crescent moon that is in the sky, and we have a Yangban man meeting his lover. And then there were also many changes in literature and poetry. So whereas literature and poetry from the first half of the Joseon dynasty, they pretty much strictly adhered to Confucian styles and the norms of that. These two started to change, and Korean scholars started to write literature and poetry that, instead of being depicted in conforming to these Chinese styles and taking place in locations in China, they now are moving into Korea and focusing on aspects of Korea. Music was the same. We have folk songs and other kind of popular music, but there's also upper class recreational music and court music, pansori, which was like a story, this long epic story that was sung, and just various versions. And these kinds of music, the content of the music would change, particularly when we look at something like pansori. These stories took place with Korean characters. So in general, what we see is this development that begins to focus more on and attempts to identify more of what is Korean. So using Korean scenes and Korean locations and Korean styles and Korean dress and Korean characters. This is the general development that we see at the end of the Joseon dynasty. Now, this comes to a head at the end of the 19th century, particularly after we see the opening of Korea, And as we have these different influences that are being introduced and then mixing and combining with what is Korean, there's a variety of reactions to all of these different influences, whether they're coming from Japan or China or from the United States or other Western countries. And and so we have um, these polarized reactions. One which is just complete rejection of Western style influences, and this was embodied in the Wijung Choksa group, or the Protect Orthodoxy, which is Protect Confucian Orthodoxy, and Reject Heterodoxy. This group, these are very conservative, radical Confucian scholars who did not want to have anything to do with some kind of tradition, mostly Western and particularly Christian traditions that they believed were heterodox and would in some way taint and corrupt their um, Confucian tradition. So you have that on one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have those that really embraced these new traditions. And I would ask you, who do you think these individuals were who were more open to it? And if now that you understand the political structure and the social structure of the Choson dynasty, the first group that should come to mind to you is the Jungin. These people, the middle people who had um, been relegated to a secondary status. They were still kind of elites, but not Yangban. And they were the group that focused on developing technical skills. So these were the court painters and the interpreters and the legal specialists and the doctors. It's this group of people that is particularly most open to Western style learning. And this is because Western style learning also emphasized the practical and the technical aspects of knowledge. And so it was very compatible for them, and they identified these opportunities that potentially were available. And so this group was very, very open to Western style learning and traditions. And then you have a very large middle ground in between these two extremes. And you have those that leaned more towards preserving Confucian scholarship, and those that leaned more towards changing and incorporating Western traditions. But there's this wide range in between. One representative school of this more moderate style, or this more moderate position, is the Eastern Ways and Western Technology group. And this was the idea that, okay, we need to preserve our principles and our morals and our values, but we should incorporate and adopt Western technology, because Western technology, particularly Western military technology, has proven superior. And given that the times have changed, then now we need to start incorporating some of these things. And so there are many variations of this Eastern Ways, Western Technology group, but in general we have this kind of accommodationist or more moderate style of change and reform. And then we also have, also compounding this, is the arrival of the first missionaries. And they are also bringing their own ideas and style of education and ways of thinking, and this really begins to shift the paradigm, because when these first missionaries come, beginning with Dr. Horace Allen, who arrived in September of 1884, um, as you know, a few months later, in December, there was a huge coup d'etat that was very violent and bloody. And, and in the process of this coup d'etat, one of the princes was slashed, and Dr. Horace Allen was the one who nursed him back to health, and as a result won the favor of the court and the trust of King Kojong. So he was appointed as the court physician. In the following year, more Protestant missionaries came, the Underwoods, the Appenzellers, the Scrantons, and when they arrived, they began setting up um, these different schools. And one of the reasons why they focused on education was because the Christianity was still illegal. As you remember from the history of Catholicism, Catholicism was looked upon with concern, and the Taewongun had initiated a series of purges and executions. And so they knew the Protestant Christian missionaries, when they arrived in Korea, they knew that this was not a favorable climate for Christianity, and that they would have to proceed with caution. And so they were told not to openly evangelize, and that they should take things in a very slow and measured way. And so what they did instead was they focused on things like medicine. Dr. Horace Allen, he opened up a hospital in 1885. Initially, it was financed by the government, but as we now know, the government was in dire straits when it came to finances. And so they were not able to continue funding this hospital. And so Horace Allen wrote to the mission boards in the United States, and a businessman named Louis Severance from Ohio heard about the problems that this hospital was having, and so he decided to donate and to fund the construction of a new building, and this is what would later become Severance Hospital, which is associated with Yonsei University. Now, how does medicine and opening up a hospital and introducing Western style medical treatment, how does this serve the Christian cause? Well, the reasoning behind this was that this could serve as an indirect form of evangelism, because if you have now Western medicine and the advances in Western science, this is tied to Western culture, and Western culture is based on Christianity. And so then we have this connection between Western medicine and Western culture and Christianity. And Western medicine then becomes kind of a cure-all, because not only can these Western trained doctors, not only can they cure physical ailments, but they can also potentially save souls. So there's this justification that the medical mission can serve as an indirect form of evangelism. They also focused on education. So this is another indirect form of evangelism. And when the Underwoods and the Appenzellers and the Scrantons arrived in Korea, they set up schools. So Peje School, Iwa School, and Gyeongjin School, these were all established by missionaries, and these were the first modern schools to be established in Korea, and that taught Western style subjects. So this included like history, geography, some math and science, and the Bible, some religious education, but they also included um, classical Chinese, because when these schools were established in the 1880s, the civil service examination is still continuing. And just for pragmatic reasons, if a Yangban wants to become a government official, in order to read all of the official documents, he has to be literate in classical Chinese. And so it's impractical to receive a pure Western style education, because that's not going to help a Yangban pass the civil service exam. So, so initially these mission schools incorporated some amount of classical style education. So for the first decade that the missionaries were here in Korea, um, they're, they were told very strictly to be very slow and very cautious, not to openly evangelize. But after 1895, between 1895 and 1905, there's a dramatic increase in the number of converts to Christianity. Why do you think this was the case? If we look at the events of 1895, what occurred in 1895? Now, if you um, if you thought about the Sino-Japanese War and Japan's victory over China in the Sino-Japanese War, that would be a huge turning point, because Japan, which the Choson dynasty historically had kind of looked down upon as a more uncivilized, uneducated, barbarian country, they had incorporated all of this Western education and Western style reforms and Western military technology, and they had defeated the almighty Qing dynasty in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. And so this proves, although up until this time, as I discussed at the beginning of the lecture, that there was all of this debate over how to change, about, you know, preserving Confucian tradition versus incorporating Western tradition versus this moderate style and mix of Eastern ways and Western technology. By 1895, it is indisputable that Western technology is superior. And so we have a real shift in attitudes that occurs at this time. And this then coincides with this huge growth of Christianity, because with the superiority of Western science and technology, now there's this, and the close association between that and Christianity. We see more of an acceptance and opening of attitudes towards Western religion. This is particularly true in the north. So if you look in the northern provinces, the growth of Christianity there was really quite phenomenal. By 1904, there were 46 boys' primary schools and 4 girls' primary schools in the north. If you look at just one location in northern Pyongan province, there were 21 primary schools, so these are all Christian schools, and 57 church groups. So Christianity really just kind of exploded up in the north. And then if we look at post-1905, the numbers increase even further. So take a look at the picture here, the numbers here, and then look at the numbers here. It's just visually you can see that there's this huge expansion and huge explosion. In 1907, there was something called the Great Revival in Pyongyang, where thousands of Koreans were converted to Christianity. Now, I have to ask you, what happened in 1907? Historically, what happened in 1907? And you should think about, um, what happened to Gojong, what was going on. We're already into the protectorate period, so this is 2 years after Korea had been forced to sign the protectorate treaty by Japan, and think about the events of 1907 that would then coincide with the Great Revival and the conversion of thousands of Koreans to Christianity. All right, so Christianity is often associated with or credited for helping to develop Korean nationalism or arousal of national consciousness, and they the credit is there because of these Christian churches that are and schools that are said to have spread Western liberal ideas, and Christian organizations such as the YMCA that helped with arranging political activities. And this is true to a certain extent, but I don't want to give too much credit to the Christian churches for this, because as I had mentioned and described at the beginning of the lecture, there was already sort of this general trend towards a focus and um, a, a an attempt to define what was Korean, and an appreciation for Koreanness. But during this period, we have most certainly the development of more of a modern kind of nationalistic culture in Korea. This newspaper called the 독립신문, or the independent newspaper, this began publication in April of 1896. This was published by Seo or Philip Jae-son, who had participated in the Kapshun coup d'etat and then had fled to Japan and then gone to the United States and received an education there. He was the first Korean to become a naturalized American citizen, and then returned to Korea to help with reforming and trying to preserve independence, and thus the name of the newspaper, The Independent. And the editors of the independent newspaper felt that education was the key to preserving Korean independence. And so they would talk extensively about, they would describe the educational system in the United States and what kind of educational reforms Korea needed to carry out. The goal, and they had a corresponding club, the Independence Club. And the goals of the Independence Club were threefold. The first was to protect Korea's independence. The second was to promote self-strengthening. So how can Korea strengthen itself in order to protect itself and to preserve Korean independence? And the third was to increase popular participation in the political process. And again, education was the key here, because you need widespread literacy, and in order to establish a common universal educational system, and the general population needs to be educated if they are going to participate politically and have a political voice. So these were the three goals of the Independence Club. There were also other nationalistic movements. There was something called the Korea Self-Strengthening Society that was established in 1906. And then a Association for Redemption of the National Debt in 1907. This was all during the Protectorate period. The Association for Redemption of National Debt, because Korea had gone into debt to Japan, their idea was that if we pay back these loans to Japan, then that maybe we can preserve our independence and sovereignty that way. And so they encouraged men to quit smoking and to donate that money that they would have paid for cigarettes to this movement. And they encouraged women to like make and sell hairpins and then donate that money to the association as well. The Japanese authorities would eventually go on to accuse this movement of embezzling money, and then it led to its demise and shut down. But there were these domestic indigenous attempts to try to restore sovereignty and protect Korean independence. There was also an attempt to redefine Korean identity. So as nationalism begins to develop in Korea, a part of this is a need to define, well, what is Korea and what does it mean to be Korean? And in order to do this, you have to define what the Korean language is and look at and start writing Korean histories. So we see now a turn towards Korean language, Korean literature, Korean history, and you have to understand that none of this was defined in the late 19th, early 20th century. You have three different systems of writing. There's classical Chinese, which is what all of the official documents have been written in. There is Hangul, or the Korean phonetic alphabet. And then there's a combination that uses both Chinese characters and the Korean alphabet. But none of this has been standardized. I mean, the classical Chinese is standardized, but nothing else has been standardized. And so the spelling, if you look at all of the different sources from that period, the spelling has not been standardized, and so there are different spellings for the same word. If you look at the style that incorporates both Chinese characters and the Korean alphabet, sometimes the Chinese character is used for the meaning, sometimes the Chinese character is used for just the pronunciation. And so there's a need to define, okay, what is the Korean language and what is the writing system that we are going to use, and then also defining Korean history. And so this starts to, as these things take place, then we begin to see a development of pride in Korea, and patriotism, and an understanding that Korea is distinct from Japan and China. So this is very different from previous Confucian style learning, which focused on China, and particularly ancient China, and identification of Korea as participating in this larger Confucian civilization. And now there is this move to distinguish Korea from China and Japan. And this is also a time where there's this creation of Korea as a nation that is an ethnic nation, and that has a shared blood and shared ancestry, and thus we begin to see the emphasis on Tangun as the founder of CHOSON. So although there were many foundation myths in Korea, the one that becomes the predominant one at the end of the 19th and early 20th century is the foundation myth of Tangun, because Tangun, he is this figure who has he's half god and half Korean, because his mother is a bear that turned into a woman, and this god and this bear/woman then had a child, and that becomes Tangun. So he arguably is pure Korean, and it is from this individual that the rest of the Korean nation then comes to be. And so this myth that Korea is one race and one pure blood, that's where these ideas then begin to come from. All right, so this is what we see developing in Korea. Let's take a little bit, and we also know pretty well what had happened in China, but let's take a closer look and compare with what was going on in China. And in China, during the end of the Qing dynasty, very, very similar issues that the Chinese are dealing with. Questions about Confucianism, questions about nationalism, and because of the intense foreign pressures that the Qing experience, and the Qing's inability to defend itself, there's quite a bit of anti-Qing, which is anti-Manchu sentiment. So we see as a result that there's educational reform, political reform, military reform, but much of this reform then spirals into rebellion, just outright rebellion, because these reform measures were often ineffective. And because the Qing were really in a pressure cooker at the end of the 19th century, and because there are so many groups that were critical of the Manchus, the Qing dynasty, that we see this culminating in anti-Qing, anti-Manchu rebellions. So Emperor Qianlong was regarded as kind of the last great emperor of the Qing dynasty, and he ruled from 1736 to 1796. So this is the previous century, in the 18th century, and then we see a decline from there. Looking at foreign relations, just to give you a little bit more detail about how foreign relations changed so dramatically, and how this then affected Chinese attitudes towards foreigners. At the end of the 18th century, we have this British diplomat, Lord Macartney, who arrives in China, and he wants to open up trade further with the Qing dynasty. And the Qing dynasty, their attitude is, we have never valued your things, these indigenous articles, nor do we have the slightest need of your country's manufacturers. Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. So it's a very arrogant attitude that the Qing dynasty has. That there's nothing that you have to offer that is of value to us, and so essentially, no, we are not going to increase our trade with you. All right, so here's a depiction of Lord Macartney. He's kneeling before the Qing emperor and making this request, and you see the Qing emperor with this very haughty attitude and totally denying him. Again, this is a more detailed response. It's kind of comical, actually. He says, your ambassador requests facilities for ships of your nation at these ports. For the future, as in the past, I decree that your request is refused and that you shall be limited to Macau. The second point, the request that your merchants may establish a repository in the capital for storing and sale of your produce. is even more impracticable than the last. This request is also refused. The third point, your request for a small island near CHOSON is a flagrant violation of the usage of my empire and cannot possibly be entertained. And then the fourth point, with regard to your request for a small site in the vicinity of Canton, where your merchants may lodge, or alternatively, there may be no restrictions on movement. It is best that the regulations now enforced should continue unchanged. And so it just goes point by point by point, denied, 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 denied. So this is a very haughty attitude of the Qing towards the British. And then, as we know, in the next century, this changes and completely flip-flops. And so we have a total reversal, not in terms of attitude or in terms of arrogance, but in terms of power relations, because whereas in the 18th century, there really isn't very much that the British can do about it, this changes. By the mid-19th century as a result of the Opium Wars, followed by the Taiping Rebellion, followed by the Boxer Uprising, the inability of the Qing dynasty to maintain control within the country, and this general upheaval that we see. And so this very arrogant and haughty attitude changes by the late 19th century, and we see that the Qing, they start to realize, okay, we do need to make some changes, and perhaps there are things that the West have to offer that could be of benefit to us. And so what they focus on is military reform. This is a picture of an arsenal and a shipyard in Fuzhou, and they did this in various areas where they tried to start importing Western military technology and then manufacturing their own weapons. Unfortunately, this did not go over so well, and the weapons that they did produce were not only inferior in quality, but ended up being more expensive to make than just importing from the West. So in 1898, and we'll talk about the significance of this year in just a moment, but in 1898, the Guangxu Emperor decides to implement reform. So 100 days of reform are initiated, and all of these different things were carried out. The civil service examination system was abolished. There was all kinds of educational reform that took place, establishing Peking University, where they would incorporate both the Chinese classics and Western style learning, agricultural schools, a modern education system where, again, would include Western style learning such as math and science, encouraging imperial family members to go abroad to study, changing the political system to a constitutional monarchy, focusing on economic reforms, industrialization, manufacturing, commerce, capitalism, and continuing on with military reform. So widespread sweeping plan of reform for the Qing dynasty. Does this sound familiar to you? It should, as this occurred 2 to 3 years after Korea's Kabul reforms that essentially did the same thing. Sweeping plan of reform in all areas, political, social, economic, educational, and incorporating Western style institutions and education. So in 1898, 3 years after the Korean Kabul reforms, the Qing dynasty initiates the same thing, and it's the timing should be also significant because this occurs again after China's loss in the Sino-Japanese War. So with China's defeat, again, it is indisputable that Western military technology is superior, and that there is something to be learned from the Western tradition. So whereas the Qing had for hundreds of years looked down on the West and said, you have nothing that we can offer, well, now we have a huge shift in attitudes. However, at the end of the 100 Days Reform, Empress Dowager, she and her supporters stage a coup d'etat, and they put the emperor under house arrest. He is sent to the Summer Palace for the rest of his days, where he would end up dying there. They execute 6 of the main officials who had initiated the 100 Days reforms, and then there's a reversion back. Some of the reforms, they still remained in place, but for the most part, this was an end to this more radical style of reform in China. And then if we skip forward to the next decade, we see that because of China's humiliation in the Sino-Japanese War and all kinds of social problems that occurred, as well as an expanding acceptance of Western ideas and institutions. This further fuels the anti-Qing, anti-Manchu sentiment that had already been developing in China, and so now we have just all-out rebellion, and this culminates in the 1911 Chinese Revolution. And so there's revolution, and this finally overturns, or is an attempt to overturn the Qing dynasty. All right, so what we see then at the end of the Qing dynasty is similar to what we saw at the end of the Joseon dynasty as well. There's just all kinds of Western ideas that are infiltrating and spreading throughout the country, especially for China. This occurs in areas with large foreigner populations such as Shanghai, a treaty port, and we see all kinds of Western culture that becomes popular in these areas. This is a picture of a dance hall where people are dancing to jazz music. But this still, it also engenders same kind of questions that the Koreans were asking over identity. So with the dissatisfaction with the Qing, there's a distancing of China, of Chinese people that want to distance themselves to this Qing or Manchu style culture, Manchu culture, and a redefining of what it means to be Chinese, and then also an emphasis and acceptance of Western science in order to perhaps solve the problems that China was experiencing. But the question remains, how much? How much do we accept these external influences? And this is exactly the same process that the Koreans were going through. Do we completely accept it? Do we go, if it's not total acceptance, is it tipping towards really a majority of acceptance, kind of the way that the Japanese did? Or do we do a more moderate style? Even the Japanese, even though that they embraced a lot of Western institutions and culture, they then moderated as time continued. And so because the emperor and other more conservative officials in Japan became concerned with Japan westernizing too much, then they started to try to moderate that reform and emphasizing things like Confucian values and loyalty to the emperor and filial piety and things like that. So these were all the same questions that the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Chinese were asking themselves as to how can we redefine our identity. And so although there are these great similarities given the historical circumstances as well as the timing, we need to look at how did these different countries, why did they respond to Western culture, institutions, ideas, and Christianity the way that they did? How did these ideas then develop and expand in the way that they did, looking at the specific historical circumstances? So this concludes our lecture for today, and then we will continue on with looking at with other forms of religion and education in particular in another lecture.